The old pickup truck crawled to a halt beneath the shadow of towering oaks, their branches clawing at the gray sky. A tired man stepped out, his breath curling in the cool air, followed by his steadfast German shepherd, ears pricked to the silence. Before them rose not a welcoming home, but the battered remains of a 120-year-old mansion, its paint peeled to bone, its walls strangled by vines like a forgotten grave. To the world, it was nothing but a curse in wood and stone, best abandoned to time. But for the PTSD veteran and his only companion, it was the last road left. And the moment he stepped inside, the house would begin rewriting both their lives. In a cramped apartment on the edge of the industrial district, Caleb Rourke sat hunched at a folding table that wobbled under the weight of his laptop. He was 50 years old, his body still carrying the hard, disciplined angles of a soldier, though his once broad frame had thinned from years of scraping by. His face was a collage of sharp planes and weathered lines, etched deep by sun, sand, and grief, with a beard of silver and black trimmed close in the habit of a man who could never quite shed the discipline of service. His eyes, pale gray and unblinking, held the distant focus of someone who had spent too many nights staring into darkness, listening for danger. At his feet, Valor shifted with a soft grunt. The 7-year-old German shepherd was a large, powerfully built dog, his black and tan coat thick and well-kept despite the meager living conditions. His head was broad, his dark eyes bright with alertness, and his ears pricked at the smallest sound. To Caleb, Valor was more than a dog. He was a partner who had marched through the dust of Iraq alongside him, slept in foxholes, and returned home carrying his own invisible wounds. The dog had a calm but constant vigilance, mirroring the man's inability to truly relax. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee gone cold and the metallic tang of the radiator, which clanked and hissed without actually warming the place. A narrow bed was shoved against one wall, neatly made out of habit rather than comfort, and a single battered duffel bag sat at the foot. The space was clean but impersonal, as if Caleb had never allowed himself to believe he'd be there long. On a shelf above the table, a photograph of a woman in her 40s leaned against the wall. Marlene, Caleb's ex-wife, had shoulder-length brown hair and a smile that had once been quick and unguarded. She'd been the kind of woman who could make a space feel warm just by being in it, but that warmth had faded under the weight of years without stability. She had left 3 years earlier, saying she couldn't keep living without a real home. Caleb hadn't tried to stop her. In his mind, a man who couldn't provide a roof wasn't a man worth tying your life to. Most evenings, Caleb would scroll through job boards or read history articles online, the television silent in the corner. Tonight, he was idly clicking through the internet's forgotten corners when a headline caught his eye: Historic Southern Property Auction. Buy a piece of the past. Curiosity got the better of him. He clicked and was greeted by a series of photographs. Grand homes with wide porches, ornate woodwork, staircases sweeping upward like something from another century. They stood in small towns he'd never heard of, most framed by ancient trees draped in Spanish moss. One thumbnail in particular drew him in. It was small and grainy, but he could make out the silhouette of a massive house, its shape blurred by vines and overgrown branches. He clicked on it, and the description was as brief as it was stark. Lot hash, H14 historic property. Needs renovation. Sold as is. No further details, just a starting bid so low it seemed almost like a joke. Caleb leaned back, folding his arms. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to imagine owning anything more permanent than a month-to-month lease. The thought of space, real space, where Valor could run, where he could hear wind in trees instead of traffic, was almost dizzying. He told himself it was ridiculous, but the idea lodged itself firmly in his mind. He clicked into the auction screen. The numbers climbed slowly. Bidders dropped out. Caleb's hand hovered over the keyboard, his heartbeat steady, but heavy in his chest. He thought of the nights in the desert, staring at the horizon, imagining a future that always felt out of reach. He thought of Marlene's parting words. You'll never give us a home. Valor shifted again, lifting his head to watch him, as if sensing a decision was near. Caleb's mouth tightened into a line. What do you think, boy? He murmured. The dog's ears twitched, but he said nothing more. He entered a bid. The numbers jumped, then slowed. Another bid came in. He matched it, then raised slightly. His jaw clenched as seconds ticked down. The screen flashed. Congratulations, you've won lot hash H14. Caleb stared at the words. He clicked to the property's detail page, and the larger images loaded one by one. The house was even more imposing than he'd realized. 3 stories, its paint curling away in wide strips, the porch sagging under years of neglect. It sat on several acres, bordered by a collapsing fence. The listing ended with a line in bold: structurally unstable. Buyer assumes all liability. A slow exhale escaped him. Hell, Valor. Looks like we just bought ourselves a challenge. He picked up the phone the next morning, intent on explaining the mistake. But the auction clerk's tone was polite and absolute. All sales were final. Funds had already been processed. There was no turning back. For the next few days, Caleb moved through his apartment like a man in a dream. He sorted through his belongings, selling anything that wouldn't fit in the back of the pickup. The battered cooler, his duffel, a box of tools, and Valor's supplies took priority. Everything else, worn-out furniture, the television he rarely used, went to the pawn shop or the dumpster. The last evening before leaving, he stood by the window, looking out over the rain-slick alley. He thought of what lay ahead. A house in a place he'd never been, a roof that might not hold, strangers who might not welcome him. But he also thought of space, of silence broken only by wind and birds, of a place that could be his. He crouched beside Valor, rubbing the dog's neck. "This is it," he said softly. "Our shot." The dog leaned into his hand, warm and steady. Caleb didn't believe in ghosts or curses. To him, a house was just wood, stone, and nails. Nothing more, nothing less. And this one, for all its decay, was a chance. He saw not the warnings in its listing, but the potential in its bones. He only thought of one thing. This could be the beginning of a new life, a home he and Valor would build together. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Caleb steered the battered pickup onto the open highway, Valor sitting upright in the passenger seat, his broad head occasionally turning to track the blur of passing scenery. They had driven for hours, the landscape slowly shifting from gray industrial sprawl to wide stretches of farmland, and then into rolling hills where the air seemed cleaner, though the chill of late winter still lingered. Caleb's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind drifted between anticipation and unease. He'd left behind everything familiar, though familiar had meant little more than rent notices and the hum of a faulty radiator. This was a gamble, but the soldier in him had always lived by calculated risks. By the time the first sign for the town appeared, the day had settled into a cold, clear light. The sign was weather-worn, the paint fading, and a handful of crows perched along the top like sentinels. As they rolled past, the road narrowed into a main street lined with small, squat buildings whose peeling facades spoke of better days. A diner with flaking red paint stood at one corner, its wide front window partially fogged. A man in a cap sat outside smoking, his gaze following the truck until it turned down the block. Caleb noticed a hardware store with an old-fashioned hand-painted sign, a post office the size of a single-room cabin, and a grocery that looked as if it hadn't changed in 30 years. The air here was still, the kind that made every engine sound louder, every footstep echo longer. As they drove slowly down the street, Caleb caught the murmur of voices. 2 women bundled in heavy coats stood outside the grocery, one holding a paper bag, the other leaning on a cane. Their conversation paused as they both turned to watch the truck. He couldn't make out every word, but the phrase, "He's the one who bought it," carried across the street. He didn't need to ask what it was. They stopped at the gas station near the edge of town. Caleb got out, the cool air biting his cheeks, and began filling the tank. The station attendant, a thin man in his early 60s with a face browned from years outdoors, stepped out from behind the counter to wipe the windshield. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and his blue coveralls hung loosely on his frame. His name tag read, G. Tucker. "You passing through?" he asked, his voice low and slow. "Moving in," Caleb replied. "Got a place down the road." Tucker squinted. "That place wouldn't happen to be the old Brantley house, would it?" Caleb nodded once. The attendant's expression flickered, something between pity and curiosity, but he said nothing more. He just nodded, wiped the last streak from the glass, and retreated inside. Caleb replaced the nozzle, climbed back into the truck, and glanced at Valor. The dog's ears were pricked, eyes scanning the quiet street, as if picking up on the undercurrent of suspicion in the air. They followed a series of winding back roads, flanked by skeletal trees whose bare branches clawed at the pale sky. The final turn led them onto a drive almost hidden by overgrowth, the gravel beneath the tires crunching sharply. When the mansion came into view, Caleb slowed to a crawl. The house was immense, more than he'd realized from the auction photos. 3 stories, its white paint long since flaked to reveal the weathered gray beneath. Shutters hung crooked, and several windows were boarded over with splintered planks. Vines climbed greedily up the columns of the wraparound porch, their tendrils gripping the wood like claws. The roof sagged in places, and a corner of the chimney appeared to lean slightly away from the main structure. Caleb parked at the edge of the drive and sat for a moment, taking it in. Valor whined softly, his gaze fixed on the darkened upper windows. Caleb felt the same pull, something between fascination and apprehension, but pushed the thought aside. He stepped out, boots crunching on the gravel, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and old leaves. As he approached the front steps, they groaned under his weight. He unlocked the heavy front door, which resisted before swinging open with a long, complaining creak. The air inside was stale, dust motes spinning in the weak light from the few windows not boarded over. The front hall was wide, with a staircase rising straight ahead. A chandelier hung above, draped in cobwebs, its crystals dulled by time. To the right, a set of double doors opened into what had once been a parlor, now stripped bare, except for a moth-eaten armchair in one corner. The floorboards there were warped, curling slightly like dried leaves. He set his pack down and unrolled his sleeping bag in the center of the hall. It wasn't comfort, but it was home for the night. Valor circled once before lying beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes still fixed on the shadowed upper landing. The first hours passed in silence, save for the occasional sigh of the wind against the old house. Caleb pulled his jacket tighter, shifting on the hard floor, his body aching from the drive. He had learned long ago to sleep wherever he could, on desert sand, on steel decking, but this place carried a different kind of weight. Somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked, not the random settling of an empty building, but deliberate, measured, as if under the weight of careful steps. Valor's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Caleb stayed still, eyes fixed on the dark opening at the top of the stairs. The sound came again. 2 steps, then silence. He forced his voice to remain even. "It's nothing," he muttered, more for Valor than for himself. But his hand rested unconsciously near the heavy flashlight in his pack. The rest of the night stretched long and uneasy. Shadows shifted with the passing clouds outside, and the air seemed to grow colder in the hours before dawn. Caleb lay awake for a long time, listening, until exhaustion finally took him. Morning light struggled through the narrow gaps in the boarded windows, drawing pale streaks across the dusty floor of the hall where Caleb and Valor had spent the night. Caleb woke stiff from the hard boards, every muscle reminding him of the long drive and the poor rest. Valor was already up, pacing slowly toward the far end of the hall, his nails clicking softly on the wood. The dog's tail was low, his ears swiveling at each faint sound. Caleb sat up, rubbing a hand over his face, the bristles of his beard rasping against his palm. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though he found himself scanning the shadows with the same vigilance. He decided to start with a basic inspection of the house. The front hall branched into several narrow corridors, each lined with doorways that opened into rooms stripped bare of furniture, but not of the smell of neglect. In one room, faded wallpaper clung to the plaster in ragged strips, revealing the gray beneath. In another, a fireplace sat cold and clogged with debris, the mantel chipped and scorched. Caleb moved slowly, making mental notes of repairs, while Valor padded close behind. When they reached the kitchen, the air shifted. It was colder here, a dampness clinging to the edges of the cracked tile floor. An old cast-iron stove sat rusting in the corner, its pipe half detached. On the far wall, a warped door leaned slightly open, revealing a steep set of stairs leading down. The smell of earth and mildew rose from below, and Valor froze at the threshold, the fur along his neck lifting. Caleb crouched and placed a steadying hand on the dog's shoulder. "Basement?" he muttered. The soldier in him weighed the instinct to check every space against the faint warning prickling at the back of his mind. He pulled the flashlight from his pack and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The steps groaned under his boots as he descended. Valor following reluctantly. The basement was low-ceilinged, with stone walls slick in places from moisture. The packed dirt floor was uneven, littered with shards of wood, rusted nails, and what looked like the remains of old crates. Cobwebs clung in thick curtains to the beams overhead, brushing against his shoulder as he passed. Caleb swept the flashlight across the space, noting shelves buckling under the weight of dusty jars, their contents long since unrecognizable. It was Valor who found the trunk. The dog's nose pressed toward a shadowed corner behind a toppled shelving unit, his breathing quickening. Caleb moved closer, the beam of light revealing a large wooden chest banded with tarnished iron. Dust lay thick across its lid, disturbed only by the faint paw prints Valor had just made. The chest's surface was scarred, the wood darkened with age and water stains. Caleb brushed away cobwebs, revealing a heavy latch. He tested it. It resisted, then gave way with a brittle snap. The lid creaked open on rusted hinges, and a stale draft of air escaped, carrying the faint scent of paper and something older, almost sweet in its decay. Inside, bundles of yellowed documents were stacked haphazardly beside a few framed photographs whose glass was clouded. Caleb lifted one frame, wiping the surface with the hem of his sleeve. The image that emerged made him pause. A formal portrait, sepia-toned, of a family standing in front of the mansion in its prime. The central figures were a stern man, in a dark suit, and a woman in a long dress, her hair pinned high, their posture rigid. Arrayed beside and behind them were several people dressed plainly, the servants. One of the men in the back row caught his breath. Tall, with broad shoulders and a square jaw, his expression sober but direct. The eyes, pale, almost silver, were the same as the ones staring from Caleb's own reflection each morning. The shape of the mouth, the lines of the cheekbones, they were uncanny. Caleb's grip on the frame tightened slightly. He set it down with care and rifled through the documents, pulling out a folded ledger that crackled at the seams. Most of the writing was in looping script, neat and deliberate. Names were listed, families, likely the staff who had worked the estate, alongside years and notations Caleb couldn't immediately decipher. But one name appeared more than once, always in the same steady hand: Eliza Harrow. The name sent a flicker of memory through him. His grandmother had spoken of her grandmother, a woman named Eliza, though the details had been sparse, just fragments of a story about hardship and work in a great house somewhere in the South. He had never connected it to any real place, assuming it was just one of those family tales that blurred with time. Now, in the damp half-light of the cellar, the pieces shifted in his mind. This house, this trunk, this name. Valor pressed against his leg, breaking his train of thought. The dog's ears were forward, eyes fixed toward the far corner, where the darkness seemed thicker. Caleb aimed the flashlight that way. Only stone wall met his gaze, but the dampness along the mortar glistened faintly. He made a note to check it later, then looked back at the trunk. Beneath the top layer of documents lay other items: a silver pocket watch tarnished to a dull gray, its chain broken, a pair of leather gloves, the fingertips worn through, and a small tin box containing a lock of hair tied with ribbon, the color faded to an indistinct pale hue. He replaced each object carefully, aware of a growing sense that these things were more than just remnants. They were fragments of lives lived entirely within these walls. The connection to Eliza Harrow settled heavily on him. This wasn't just a purchase anymore. It was, in some inexplicable way, a return. He stood, brushing dust from his jeans, and closed the trunk with a soft thud. Valor stayed close as they made their way back up the stairs, the wooden steps protesting under their combined weight. At the threshold of the kitchen, Caleb paused to take one last look into the darkness below. He felt as though the house had just given him a piece of its story, just enough to pull him in deeper. And somewhere beneath the weight of dust and years, the air seemed to whisper that there was more yet to be found. The next morning, the sky was gray with low-hanging clouds that pressed heavily against the rooftops, casting the town in a pale, almost colorless light. Caleb pulled on his faded jacket and stepped out of the house, Valor trotting beside him with quiet purpose. The night had left them both uneasy. Caleb had lain awake for hours, staring at the cracked ceiling. The image of the stranger in the photograph still burned into his thoughts. The resemblance hadn't faded in memory. It had only grown more unsettling. He had to know more. The town's library sat at the far end of Main Street, a squat brick building with ivy creeping up one side, half of its front windows fogged with condensation. A rusted bell above the door gave a half-hearted chime as Caleb entered. The space was warm and quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and wood polish. Behind the front desk sat a woman with snow-white hair pulled into a loose bun, a knitted shawl wrapped over her shoulders, despite the radiator humming nearby. She wore round spectacles perched low on her nose, and her pale blue eyes were sharp with the clarity of someone who noticed everything, even if she said little. Her name tag read, Mrs. Dorothy Ellis. She looked up from a cloth-bound book as Caleb approached, offering a polite but measured smile. "You're the man who bought the Patterson place," she said before he could speak. Her voice was soft, but carried a firmness that hinted she wasn't easily startled. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Name's Caleb Rourke." Mrs. Ellis studied him a moment longer, her gaze drifting to the dog standing alertly at his side. "And this must be your partner," she said. "Valor," Caleb replied, giving the dog a pat on the flank. "He doesn't bite unless asked nicely." The librarian gave a quiet chuckle and gestured to the reading tables. "Take a seat. I'll fetch you something." She disappeared into the back stacks, moving slower than she likely had in her younger years, but still with purpose. Caleb sat near the large window, Valor settling at his feet. Outside, the clouds continued to drift, and the occasional car passed slowly down the street. When Mrs. Ellis returned, her arms were full. Several large books, some bound in cracked leather, others in worn cloth. She placed them gently on the table. "This town's history is short but layered," she said. "Some parts are tidy, some are not." Caleb opened the first book, the pages brittle at the edges. "You said Patterson. You knew the house?" Her expression grew more serious. She sat down across from him, folding her hands. "Knew of it. Everyone here does, though most try not to talk about it." She glanced toward the window, as if checking who might be listening. "The Patterson family were landowners," she continued. "Moved here just after the Civil War. Built the house, brought their wealth and influence with them. And they brought people, too. Housekeepers, farmhands, nannies. Most of them black, and most of them poor." Caleb flipped a few pages, spotting an old photograph of the town in its earliest days. The mansion stood at the edge like a sentinel, surrounded by trees. "Things were quiet for a long while," Mrs. Ellis went on, voice lowering. "But sometime around 1920, the family disappeared. One night, just gone. No one ever found their bodies. No letters, no clues." "Run off?" Caleb asked, not convinced. "That's one story," she said. "Another says the people who worked for them rose up, took back what had been taken from them. But that's just a rumor." Caleb thought of the trunk in the cellar, of the sharp, tired eyes in the photograph, of the name, Eliza Harrow. "Do you know that name?" he asked. "Eliza Harrow?" Mrs. Ellis's brow furrowed gently. "That I do. She was a housekeeper there, lived on the property, they say. Some claim she was more than that. Educated, unusually so. Wrote letters, kept records. I don't think she ever left that house, even after the Pattersons vanished." She rose again and returned a moment later with a slim green binder. Inside were copies of old census records, property deeds, and faded news clippings. Caleb flipped through until he found it. Eliza Harrow, listed in the 1910 census as house servant, live-in, age 42. His breath caught. That lined up exactly with what his grandmother had said, that her grandmother had worked for a white family in the South, a woman known for her iron will and tidy handwriting. As he copied down the references, Mrs. Ellis leaned back slightly. "You know, most people wouldn't bother with this," she said. "They'd paint over the walls and pretend history never happened." "I'm not most people," Caleb replied quietly. The librarian nodded once, firmly. "Good." After thanking her, he made his way to the copy machine and duplicated several pages, the census sheet, a news snippet reporting the Pattersons' disappearance, and a short blurb about property turnover in 1923, with Eliza's name listed under caretaker. Outside, the air had turned colder, and Valor's breath fogged in front of his muzzle. Caleb placed the papers carefully in his satchel and climbed into the truck. As he pulled out of the lot, he spotted a figure watching him from across the street. A young man stood near a lamppost, arms crossed, wearing a flannel jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. His hair was dirty blonde, curling slightly at the ends, and his face was narrow with a certain nervous energy. When Caleb met his eyes, the man looked away quickly and walked off toward the alley. Back at the house, Caleb placed the copies on the kitchen counter, now cleared of dust and clutter. He stared at the name Eliza Harrow, seeing it not just as a link in a line of ancestry, but as the beginning of a truth long buried. Something happened in this house, and she had seen it all. The midday sun filtered weakly through gray clouds, casting long, weary shadows over the overgrown grounds behind the mansion. Caleb crouched beside the porch, hacking at the stubborn weeds that curled like green fingers around broken stone steps. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, and each movement sent a dull ache through his shoulder, a reminder of shrapnel that never quite left his body. Just like the nightmares, Valor paced near the edge of the brush, his ears up, tail low. The German shepherd, now 10 years old, still moved with the discipline of a soldier, but had grown more sensitive in his old age. He sniffed at something beyond the thorny overgrowth, then let out a low, insistent growl, pawing at the earth. Caleb stood, wiped his brow with a calloused hand, and followed his dog's signal. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Valor whined and looked back at him, then returned to digging at a patch of moss-covered ground beneath an ancient oak tree whose limbs hung like sorrowful arms. Caleb pushed back the brush and stopped cold. There, half swallowed by earth and time, were the corners of stone markers. Headstones. Weather-worn and tilting at odd angles, the stones had been hidden so long that roots had wrapped themselves around them like shackles. He knelt slowly and ran a hand over the closest one, brushing away years of caked dirt and green moss. The engraving was faint, almost gone, but he could make out a name. Eliza Harrow. His breath caught. Below the name, a date. 1868, 1920. The name echoed in his mind like a whisper through the pines. Eliza. The name from the trunk. The name from the librarian's tale. The name his grandmother had mentioned, almost in reverence. He looked up at the sprawling mansion behind him, then back at the grave. His throat tightened. It wasn't just a name anymore. This was someone who had lived, breathed, walked these very grounds. Someone of his blood. Caleb sat there for what felt like hours. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at the stone as memories of long-forgotten family stories played in his mind like old film reels. His grandmother's voice drifted through time. Eliza worked in a grand house down south. She never came back. He thought it was folklore. Now he was kneeling at her grave. Later that afternoon, with the storm clouds gathering far in the distance, Caleb returned to the makeshift graveyard carrying a small wire brush and a bucket of warm water. He cleaned each headstone he could find, 7 in total, each with faded names, some too worn to read, others still barely legible. One was for a child, LM, age 6. Another simply read, Martha, faithful friend. Servants? Family? Caleb didn't know, but the air felt heavier here, and not just from the thick humidity. He took a notepad from his back pocket and began jotting down the names, careful to preserve them in ink, even if the stone would someday fail. As he worked, Valor lay beside Eliza's stone, unmoving, head resting on his paws. Occasionally the dog's ears would twitch, as if listening for something Caleb couldn't hear. As twilight painted the trees in hues of lavender and blue, Caleb sat cross-legged near Eliza's grave, now cleared and defined. "You were here all this time," he whispered, "buried in a place no one remembered. Until now." He wasn't sure who he was talking to, her, himself, or the silence, but the connection was real, and the ache in his chest felt strangely like purpose. The next morning, he drove into town and stopped at a small hardware store, tucked between a shuttered bakery and a thrift shop. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s, wiry and sun-darkened, with a slight limp and an unlit pipe tucked into the corner of his mouth. He looked up with a start when Caleb entered. "You're the one who bought the Patterson house," the man said, setting down a faded newspaper. His voice was low and rough, like someone who had smoked too long or shouted too often. Caleb nodded. "Yeah, name's Caleb Rourke." The man extended a hand. "Tom Benton, served in Nam. You got the look." Caleb gave a weary smile and shook his hand. "Iraq, twice." They shared a quiet understanding, two soldiers separated by decades but bound by memory. Caleb told him about the graveyard, the names, the discovery of Eliza. Tom's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Used to be folks around here, said the old Patterson place had a family plot, he said, but nobody went near it. Not after, well, after they all disappeared. Some say the house cursed anyone who tried to settle in it. Others say it just remembers. Remembers what? Caleb asked. Pain, Tom said simply. Hurt gets into the wood, into the soil. Caleb left with new tools, a small American flag, and a wooden cross he planned to stake near Eliza's headstone. That evening, he did just that, planting it carefully, as if tucking a child into bed. He sat again by the grave, Valor pressed close to his leg, the breeze stirring the long grass. He still didn't understand the full story, but he knew this. He wasn't here by accident. The house had found him, or maybe Eliza had. The morning after Caleb had reset the leaning stone of Eliza Harrow's grave, the sky turned a shade darker than usual. Not stormy, just heavy, like the air was holding its breath. Caleb stood silently by the back window of the crumbling house, sipping the last of his weak coffee from a tin cup. Valor, his 5-year-old German shepherd with deep brown eyes and a fading scar above his right leg, lay watchful near the door, ears twitching with every creak from above. The house had been quieter since the grave clearing, but Caleb couldn't shake the sensation of something or someone waiting. He knew the logical answer. Too many nights of bad sleep in the back of his truck. Too many memories clawing their way out from beneath the layers he'd buried in the desert heat. But still, there was something else. That afternoon, determined to find the truth hinted at in the photograph from the trunk, Caleb returned to the basement with a flashlight and crowbar in hand. The air was thick with mildew and time. Every step he took stirred dust into ghosts. Valor followed, fur bristling slightly, tail low but not tucked. A soldier's dog, always alert. Caleb examined the stone walls closely this time. Near the edge of the western wall, where mold had left a greenish smudge, he spotted a seam. Slight, almost dismissible. The flashlight's beam glinted off something wedged between two stones, a rusted nail. He pried it loose, revealing a hidden notch in the wall. Behind it, an envelope. It was sealed in wax. The paper had yellowed, brittle at the corners. On the front, in looping cursive ink, to the one who carries the blood. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The ink had faded but remained legible. If you have found me, then you are kin, and you have heard the whispers. Our truth is buried deeper than their lies. They never found the room. You must. The house remembers. It will guide you. Eliza Harrow. The message left Caleb cold. He sat down on the nearest step, letter trembling in his rough, calloused hands. He remembered his grandmother's voice, stories she once told of a southern house and a woman named Eliza, a name only whispered like folklore, a woman wronged, a woman whose blood still called. But now, there was another problem: money. The place was falling apart faster than he could patch it. The roof in the north wing had partially collapsed, and the living room still smelled like dead rodents and mildew. Caleb had already drained most of the leftover savings from his veteran's benefit into buying gas, basic tools, and enough canned food to keep Valor and himself alive. He'd hoped to stretch it longer, but reality had crept in like the mold in the walls. By week's end, they moved into the truck permanently. Again. The old green pickup now served as bedroom, kitchen, and shelter. Parked under a leaning oak near the back of the estate, it offered a view of the house and the graveyard. Days were spent pulling nails, reinforcing broken floorboards with salvaged wood, and clearing out nests of raccoons. At night, they returned to the truck, Valor curled beside him, their breath visible in the chilled air. But when darkness fell over the mansion, the silence was never complete. It started with tapping. Not consistent, but deliberate. 3 knocks, always from inside the boarded-up east wing. Then, a sigh. Faint. Too soft to be wind. Valor would lift his head each time, ears stiff, growl low in his throat, but not hostile. Curious. Almost protective. On the 3rd night, the knocking came again. This time, it was followed by the soft scuffle of movement upstairs. Caleb rose, flashlight in hand, stepping out of the truck and toward the house. Valor followed, nose twitching, tail low but steady. They entered through the back. The boards creaked under Caleb's boots. He paused at the base of the stairs, sweeping the beam of his flashlight upward. No movement. Just dust, dancing like ghosts in the light. But when he stepped onto the first stair, the air shifted, cooler, heavier, as if the house had exhaled. He didn't go all the way up. Not yet. Instead, he turned and entered the basement once more. The letter in his back pocket pulsed like a heartbeat. This time, he stared at the walls, not for paper, but for design. The stones in the far corner of the room were different, smoother, more even, hand-cut. He knocked on them, and the third one gave a faint, hollow sound. "I knew it," he muttered. He dropped to his knees and began scraping at the edges with a chisel. Valor paced nearby, occasionally sniffing the air as if waiting for permission. When the first stone came loose, a gust of cold air brushed his face. He leaned in and peered inside. Darkness. A narrow passage, descending. Too small for standing, but enough to crawl. He turned to Valor. "Not tonight," he whispered. "Tomorrow." Outside, the wind picked up. That night in the truck, Caleb stared at the ceiling of his camper shell. Sleep wouldn't come. He thought of Eliza's grave, the letter, the whispers. The house wasn't haunted. It was waiting. The next morning, the frost on the truck's windows clung like fingerprints from another world. Caleb, weary but resolved, sipped his lukewarm coffee and stared at the house as Valor paced anxiously nearby. The dog hadn't slept well either, having woken several times to stare into the dark, growling lowly, ears twitching at nothing visible. Caleb trusted Valor's instincts more than his own these days. He decided to begin repairs on the old study room on the west side of the house, the one that had likely served as a small library or office for the original owners. The walls were lined with cracked paneling, once rich mahogany now dulled by moisture and rot. Most of the shelves were bare, but a few books remained, their spines bowed and ink faded. Caleb pulled the tarp from the broken window, letting daylight pierce through the grime-streaked glass. He moved methodically, prying off warped boards and removing mold-ridden planks. Then something odd caught his eye. A section of the far wall sounded hollow when tapped. It wasn't subtle. Caleb paused, knelt, and knocked again. The sound echoed differently. He stepped back and retrieved his crowbar. Valor came to sit beside him, his breath steaming in the cold air, eyes alert. The boards came away easier than expected, revealing not another wall, but a gap, no more than 3 feet wide, leading into darkness. Caleb hesitated. This wasn't part of any floor plan he'd seen. He looked back at Valor. "You first," he said with a small grin. Valor didn't move. Smart dog. So Caleb ducked and entered the space alone, one hand holding the flashlight, the other brushing aside cobwebs. The narrow corridor extended a few feet, then stopped abruptly at what looked like a wooden door built directly into the stone foundation of the house. It was unlike any other door in the mansion, no brass handle, no frame, just aged oak, slightly warped, with iron hinges nearly swallowed by rust. Carved into the surface, faint but deliberate, were initials, A.H. "Eliza Harrow," Caleb whispered. He pressed a palm to the door. It was cold. The air was still. Then, with effort, he pushed. The door groaned as if waking from 100-year sleep. Dust poured down like ash. Beyond it lay a small sealed room, preserved almost too perfectly, unlike the decayed rest of the house. A desk stood at the center, its surface covered in an arrangement of letters, a leather-bound journal, and several black and white photographs, all undisturbed. The walls bore shelves holding jars of dried herbs, small tools, candle stubs. In one corner stood a trunk, closed but unlatched. There was no dust here, no mold, no animal nests. Caleb felt as if he had crossed a threshold, not just physical, but spiritual. He stepped in cautiously. Valor remained just outside the door, whining lowly. On the desk, one photo immediately drew Caleb's attention. A young black woman stood beside a child in front of the house, the same house, decades younger. Her eyes were deep and sad, but her posture proud. The back of the photo read, "Eliza and Miriam, 1915. Miriam? Caleb's mind reeled. Could this be Eliza's daughter, his great-grandmother, perhaps? He didn't know of any Miriam in family stories. He flipped through the journal, thumbing through pages filled with fine cursive. Eliza wrote about the bitterness of servitude, the injustices faced in the Patterson household. the loss of her husband to illness, the refusal of Mr. Patterson to allow proper burial. One entry stopped him cold. "They will not let us rest in dignity. I have begun to gather the others. We will not be silent forever. If my blood ever returns to this house, may they find this place. May they know we tried." Caleb sat down on the worn stool before the desk. The room seemed to pulse around him. He had grown up hearing fragments of family folklore, a southern estate, a woman wrongly blamed, whispered lines about dignity and defiance. Now those echoes were manifest in ink and wood. Suddenly he felt less like a stranger here. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted. Shadows reached across the hallway like long fingers. Caleb reluctantly packed the journal and a few letters into his satchel. He would need to read more, perhaps everything. This wasn't just about history. This was inheritance, a legacy not of land or title, but of truth. Back in the main room, he sealed the hidden door again. Not to bury it, but to protect it. No one else in town had mentioned this place. Not Tom at the hardware store, not the librarian, not even the old-timers watching him from porches. That night, after feeding Valor the last of their beef jerky rations, Caleb lit a small campfire behind the house. The stars shimmered coldly above, indifferent but watchful. He opened the journal again, flipping to the final page. There, in different handwriting, fresher ink, less formal script, were the words, "They tried to forget her, but the land didn't, nor the bones, nor the wind." Caleb stared at it for a long time. He didn't know who had written that last line, maybe another descendant, maybe a loyal friend, or maybe Eliza herself, toward the end. One thing was certain now, he hadn't just bought a house. He had inherited a story that someone, long ago, had hidden with hope. The late afternoon sun filtered softly through the warped glass of the attic windows as Caleb stood hunched over the old writing desk. Dust motes floated lazily in the golden light, casting shadows across the fragile journal pages spread before him. He held his breath as he turned each one with care, aware that he was touching something sacred, something meant only for him. The air in the hidden room felt thick, still carrying the scent of cedar and old ink. Valor lay beside him, head resting on crossed paws, eyes half-lidded but watchful. Caleb could feel his heart pounding not from fear, but from the sheer weight of revelation pressing down on his chest. The journal entries grew more intimate and frantic toward the end. Eliza's handwriting became tighter, angrier. The words bled into the margins. They took everything. Their kindness was a lie, and their discipline a mask for cruelty. But I remember the land before it turned sour. I remember the songs, the names, the bloodline that will one day come home. And then there it was, the final entry. If you're reading this, child of mine, you are blood. You are Harrow. This house is yours, not just to keep, but to cleanse. Build something worthy. Make them remember us not in whispers, but in truth. Caleb sat back, his throat thick with something too complicated to be called sadness. The pieces had finally come together. The mansion wasn't cursed by ghosts. It was haunted by memory, by injustice, by generations of silence. He felt pride, sorrow, and something else. Clarity. He glanced down at Valor, who gave a soft thump of his tail against the wooden floor, as if sensing the shift in his master's resolve. Caleb whispered, "We're not just squatters here, boy. We belong, and we've got work to do." In the following days, Caleb's mission took on a new shape. No longer just a man fixing up a forgotten house, he became a keeper of legacy. With whatever money he had left, he began small, replacing broken shutters, scrubbing soot off the parlor walls, sanding down the floorboards. He worked slowly, methodically, carefully preserving the charm of what Eliza and her people had once known. He turned the old parlor into a memorial room. There, he displayed the photographs and letters he had uncovered, along with the journal and documents that proved Eliza's life. On the wall above the mantel, he hung the enlarged photo of Eliza as a young woman, stoic, proud, eyes sharp as flint. One morning, as he was replacing cracked tiles on the porch, a voice called out from beyond the fence. "You Caleb Rourke?" a deep, deliberate voice asked. Caleb looked up to see a tall man leaning against the wooden gate. He wore a khaki uniform shirt with an old-fashioned sheriff's star pinned to the pocket. His skin was dark bronze, weathered, his silver hair tied back in a short ponytail. The man's face bore a complex expression, half suspicion, half respect. "Name's Sheriff Langston. Heard you bought this place." Caleb nodded. "I did." "You plan on keeping it?" "I do." There was a pause. "Good," Langston said at last. "Just wanted to see who had the guts to walk into Patterson House and stay." The sheriff didn't linger, but before leaving he added, "Folks in town don't know the truth. They grew up on stories. But some of us remember what our grandmothers told us. Eliza wasn't just a maid. She was a force." That afternoon, Caleb sat under the willow tree beside Eliza's grave, valor stretched out at his feet. He felt the breeze run through the overgrown grass and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the silence didn't ache. It comforted. He began writing, a journal of his own. Not for himself, but for whoever would come after. So the truth wouldn't be hidden behind walls again. Each page started with, "I came to this house broken, but Eliza helped me remember who I was." In time, word began to spread. First, a curious reporter from the local paper came sniffing around. Then, a young woman named Ava Harrow, a graduate student in history with soft eyes and a skeptical smile, knocked on the door and asked if she could study the documents. She had hair the color of wheat and pale, freckled skin. She claimed to be a distant cousin. They sat at the kitchen table and drank weak coffee from chipped mugs as she traced her lineage with faded papers, confirming ties to Eliza's sister. Caleb, cautious at first, warmed to her honesty. He found her quiet resolve familiar, like the strength of someone who knew silence wasn't absence, just waiting. Soon, Ava offered to help preserve the mansion officially. She connected Caleb with a local heritage grant. With that support, they fixed the front porch completely, replaced shattered windows with handmade glass, and brought in volunteers to catalog the artifacts. By the first snow, the Patterson House, no, the Harrow House, was no longer a hushed legend. It became a place of truth, of healing. A place where a broken veteran and his dog had found not just shelter, but a purpose. On the front gate, a wooden plaque was placed, carved by hand. "Eliza's legacy lives here." That night, as the snow fell gently over the roof, Caleb lit the fireplace and sat beside Valor. He placed Eliza's journal on the mantel, beside his own. And for the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel lost. The early morning fog hung low over the hills, draping the mansion in a ghostly veil. Caleb stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, a claw hammer in one hand, the other resting on Valor's head. His breath rose in silver spirals as he looked up at the house that had once loomed like a specter of the past. Now it was something else. Wounded, yes, but no longer rotting. Like him, it was learning how to stand again. Weeks had passed since Eliza's words changed everything. The cold had crept into their bones, but Caleb pushed forward, one board, one nail, one memory at a time. Valor, now nearly 6 years old, thick-furred and sharp-eyed, never left his side. His black and tan coat was often flecked with sawdust and bits of paint, but he seemed to take pride in their progress, tail wagging with each room made whole. The money was nearly gone. Caleb had sold off his old truck, cashed his last military check, and even pawned a watch he once wore through 2 deployments. What he had left was sweat, grit, and a promise he couldn't shake. Eliza's journal rested every night beneath his pillow like a vow. Word of what he was doing had begun to spread. At first, it was whispers. Some scoffed, some snickered. But curiosity replaced mockery as the townsfolk began to notice the changes. The broken shutters had been replaced with hand-cut cedar, each window now framed with a fresh coat of cream paint. Where the roof had sagged like a weary spine, shingles now gleamed in neat rows. One afternoon, as he was hauling up reclaimed wood from the back path, a voice called out, "You could use real lumber, you know." Caleb turned to see a broad-shouldered man in his 60s walking up the path, sun-browned with deep-set laugh lines and calloused hands. His beard was thick and white, covering a jaw like chiseled stone. He carried 2 long planks balanced over his shoulder. "Name's Hank Donnelly," the man said, lowering the wood with a grunt. "Saw what you were doing here. Figured you wouldn't mind some leftovers from my shed." Caleb blinked in surprise. "That's generous," Hank shrugged. "Used to work framing houses. Did the old parsonage down on Walnut. Figured this place deserves better than to rot out its bones. From then on, help came in small waves. A pair of teenage brothers from town, Luis and Carter, began showing up after school, offering to sweep or carry beams. Luis was lean with shaggy dark hair and a crooked grin. Carter, the younger, had freckles and an awkward kindness that reminded Caleb of his younger self. They didn't ask questions about the past, they just worked. Even Mrs. Yarrow, the prickly woman who ran the antique store, sent over a box of brass hardware and fixtures. "Real pre-war stuff," she muttered as she dropped the box on the porch. "Not junk." Ava returned every weekend, bringing fresh bread and a laptop full of research. She had begun compiling Eliza's story into a digital archive. One evening, she handed Caleb a printout of the Harrow family tree, newly updated. "You're not alone in this," she said gently. "There's more than one root in this soil." Inside the house, Caleb hung portraits along the hallway walls. Black and white photos of men and women in aprons, sun hats, work shirts. Former servants. Forgotten faces. He printed and framed old census records, marriage licenses, and clippings. Visitors entering the foyer would now face these eyes first, not the grandeur of faded wallpaper or staircases. Caleb called it the Hall of Truth. Valor's favorite spot was beside the front door, where a patch of sun warmed the floorboards. Each time someone knocked, he rose with a low, curious bark, no longer the suspicious guard, but more of a watchful host. Of course, not everyone approved. One night, a stone shattered the front window. Caleb rushed down to find the glass broken and a note tied to the rock. "Let the dead lie. Patterson stays Patterson." His hands clenched around the paper, but he didn't chase ghosts anymore. Instead, he fixed the window, stronger than before. That morning, the retired Sheriff Langston showed up with a toolbox. "Heard what happened," the man said, kneeling beside the broken glass. "Figured you could use a few extra hands." His stern features softened. "There'll always be people who fear truth. That's why we build louder than they whisper." By mid-November, the house stood brighter. The veranda, once caved in, now welcomed boots and laughter. The garden out front bore the first signs of winter herbs, planted by Ava and Carter, who discovered a love for soil Caleb hadn't expected. Still, he knew the work wasn't just with wood and plaster. He visited Eliza's grave each week, clearing leaves, laying wildflowers, reading aloud from the journal. Some nights, after long hours, he'd sit alone on the back steps with Valor curled against him and whisper stories of what they'd accomplished, like a child reporting to a watchful elder. "This isn't just a house anymore," he said to the wind one evening. "It's your story, and it's ours now, too." And though the curse rumors lingered in dusty corners, more and more people came to see for themselves. Not ghosts, but life. They brought stories, offerings, apologies. One elderly woman named Doris, short and round, with curls of white hair and kind eyes, stood in the hall, tears running freely down her face as she stared at the photo of her great-aunt Matilda, a cook who once served in the Patterson kitchen. "She never got to leave this house proud," Doris whispered. "But now, she's looking out from these walls." In that moment, Caleb understood. He hadn't just repaired a building. He had revived a voice, a lineage, a sacred silence that deserved to be sung out loud. The morning sun cast its golden light over the estate, no longer shrouded in shadows and rot, but glistening with fresh paint, polished wood, and the quiet pride of rebirth. The old Patterson mansion stood tall again, not in grandeur, but in truth. Caleb Rourke stood at the edge of the front porch, arms crossed over his chest, sweat still dampening his shirt collar. His silver-streaked beard caught the breeze as he looked across the gravel path that had once been overrun with weeds. Beside him sat Valor, the 5-year-old black and tan German shepherd, calm, alert, with his scarred paw resting neatly on the wood floor. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying memories and promises alike. It had taken months. Every board nailed, every floor scrubbed, every broken shutter replaced by hand. Caleb had worked past pain, through cold mornings and hot afternoons, pushing back the ghosts of war and sorrow. And in the process, the mansion had become something else. Not a burden, not a curse, but a canvas for redemption. Today was its unveiling. He hadn't invited many, just a scattering of blood relatives, distant cousins who still remembered old family stories, and a few townsfolk who had come to believe in him. especially those who had helped when he had nothing left but grit and a German shepherd who refused to give up on him. The guests began arriving around noon. The first to step out of the dust-speckled pickup truck was Lorraine, a second cousin from Texas. She was in her late 50s, tall and wiry, with streaks of gray in her thick braid and sun-worn skin that smelled faintly of wild lavender. Her smile was cautious at first, but when she laid eyes on the house, her lips parted in awe. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. It really was true, wasn't it? Next came Emmett, Caleb's younger cousin, a balding man in his 40s with a soft voice and an old knee brace that made him walk with a subtle limp. A historian by trade, Emmett had once dismissed the Patterson estate as a fable tangled in whispers. But when Caleb showed him the old journals, letters, and photos, Eliza's truth carved in ink, his skepticism turned to reverence. One by one, more arrived. Distant aunts with trembling hands, young nieces he'd never met until now, a boy who shared his jawline and dimples, though they hadn't spoken in years. Some brought food, some brought folded quilts, all brought curiosity and emotion. In the afternoon, they gathered in the backyard, beneath a canvas canopy Caleb had strung between trees. A table stood near the garden, laid with pitchers of lemonade and trays of cornbread. And beneath the great oak, its limbs stretching out like protective arms, Caleb had set up a simple memorial. A brass plaque sat at the foot of Eliza Harrow's grave, newly restored, surrounded by trimmed grass and small wildflowers Valor had trampled into the soil while sniffing about. Caleb stepped forward, hands slightly trembling, voice deep and steady. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his eyes moving from face to face. "I didn't bring you here just to see a house. I brought you here because you deserve to know the truth of our family." He paused, drawing breath. Eliza Harrow wasn't just a name on a headstone. She was a woman of strength, a woman who endured cruelty and hardship, and who, in the end, helped lead a quiet rebellion for freedom. Her story was erased from the official records, buried, forgotten, but not anymore. There was a silence, and then the softest sniffle from Lorraine. Caleb continued, unfolding one of Eliza's letters, reading her words aloud. Her handwriting had faded, but the emotion pulsed strong through every syllable. "If my descendants find this, know that this land holds our pain and our promise. Make it right, and never let them forget." When he finished, Caleb placed the letter back into the wooden box at the base of the tree and stepped aside. Emmett took over then, sharing some of the research he had done since Caleb first reached out. His voice was lighter, more scholarly, but even he couldn't hide the pride. "What Caleb's done here is more than renovation," Emmett said. "It's restoration, of truth, of honor." Later, as dusk began to slip into the horizon, lanterns flickered on along the porch and garden path. The guests dined on warm dishes beneath a sky brushed with orange and lavender. Laughter echoed between the trees, soft, healing, and unforced. Children ran across the porch where floorboards no longer groaned with age, but hummed with life. Caleb stood in the doorway, Valor pressed against his leg. The dog was tired but watchful, his eyes scanning the yard before relaxing at last, tail thumping once against Caleb's boot. "We did it, buddy," Caleb murmured. Inside, the house glowed. Pictures of Eliza and the others, Sarah, Matthew, Clara, lined the hallway walls. Caleb had made sure their names were carved in wood above each frame, a symbol of remembrance, a refusal to let history fade again. As the evening wound down, the final moment arrived, a small ceremony Caleb had planned but told no one about. He led the guests into the parlor, where a single armchair faced the fireplace. On the mantel sat the family crest, long buried under rotten dust, now cleaned and gleaming in the firelight. Caleb walked to it, and for the first time in his life, he placed a hand upon it without hesitation. "This is home," he said, "not just for me, for all of us, and for those who came before." Outside, the wind stirred again, gentler this time, and some, though they would never admit it, felt a presence move through the house like a warm breath. Peace, at last. That night, when the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Caleb lay in his bed beneath a repaired roof. The window was cracked open, letting in the cool breeze. Valor curled at the foot of the bed, already snoring softly. And Caleb, staring up into the wooden beams, whispered a quiet thank you to Eliza, for the letter, for the truth, for the strength to come home. For the first time in years, he closed his eyes, not to forget, but to rest. Sometimes, God doesn't speak through thunder or miracles that split the skies. Sometimes, he whispers through broken floorboards, faded letters, and the soft breath of a dog lying at your feet. Caleb didn't go searching for a miracle, but through loss, silence, and years of wandering, he found what so many long for: a place to belong, a purpose greater than pain, and a home not made of walls, but of truth, memory, and grace. Maybe you too have walked through seasons of grief, wondering if what you've lost could ever be restored. But don't lose hope. Sometimes God leads us not to where we want to go, but exactly where we are meant to heal. If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave us a comment, tell us your story or who you're praying for, and don't forget to subscribe to join us in more stories that honor the resilience of the human soul. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may He remind you, even in ruins, something sacred can still rise.